Hi, everyone. Good to see you again. Or you can see me rather. This is Stuart Gandalf leading another podcast. And yes, you can see us if you're watching via YouTube. Of course, if you're streaming via one of the streaming services, you're only listening. But at any rate, good to be with you. Today, I am going to unveil one of our company's secret weapons. And Brandon Schakola was introduced to us a while back by multiple of the best marketing people I know in search. When we were looking for a new department lead, those are certainly big shoes to fill. An agency that already prided itself on strong search capability, and Brandon has over delivered. I'm super proud of the work he's done for us and doing for our clients. Super smart, leads up all of our SEO, all of our tech stack, pretty much anything to do with these kinds of topics. Brandon, welcome.
Thanks, Stuart.
Good to see you again. It's only been
Oh,
what, an hour since our
it's
last.
been about an hour. Yeah.
So, Brandon, we're going to talk about a lot of things. I guess before I do that, can you just give people a sense of your background so maybe they'll love you almost as much as I do?
Sure. So I'm Brandon Schakola. I'm the head of SEO here at Healthcare Success, as well as working with all the technical product and delivery. Previous lives, I was at Overstock during the rebrand to Bed Bath and Beyond. Spent about 3 years at eBay through the pandemic, which was a wild experience. Lots of really smart people there. And prior to that, I was agency side for about a decade at a small boutique agency based out of LA called the Search Agency, which is where I got my chops in SEO. And then previous to that, I was in various kinds of IT roles, worked for a very small startup that actually trained the U.S. Air Force and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Section 508 compliance back in the day. So it's kind of funny that my world is kind of wrapped back around to another sort of government issue that we deal with all the time with like HIPAA laws and whatnot. But yeah, it's been a wild ride in the world of search the last couple of years for sure.
So, those of our readers who aren't familiar with this, the search world is kind of I don't know, it's a club, right, Brandon? We see each other at the same conferences. We know a lot of the same people, like especially at the high level. Like people know people, and in fact, it's funny. I was just talking to one of the people we recruited recently. It's like, oh, that was from another person I know. So anyway, Brandon's in the cool kids club when it comes to SEO for sure. So Brandon, this meeting was inspired today on a lot of our internal conversations about how search has changed over the years. And, we like to, at our agency, Healthcare Success, always like to be at the forefront, not just where things were, but where they're going. Yet a lot of times when we take over accounts from clients, like if they'd had SEO before, it might be something that was really great a decade ago, but really the fundamental foundations no longer make sense. And I believe you said the other day, stop thinking less about keywords, more about queries. And so we're going to talk about that today. Like, how do we make sense of, first of all, where we were, where search grew up? More importantly, we'll get past that stage for our listeners' sake and talk about what can they do today to be more effective. So, Brent, let's start off though with a little history lesson of, like how has search changed over the last decade or so?
Yeah. So prior to the last decade, like you and I, we grew up with like that exact match search world, right? We were early adopters of the web, and and that world was full of keywords. Essentially, you had a keyword, it could find the word in a document, and it showed up. But then, as a lot of that technology progressed, obviously, kind of sped along by ads. In the early days, you had AOL, and gosh, there's probably search engines I've forgotten about. Gopher, there were a bunch out there, and so as that ads world started to boom, they started to grow the types of things we could look for. Right, we got out of exact match, we got to broad match, we got to phrase match. And then eventually we got to, being able to search for images even, or different media types, when entering into about, 2008 to 2010 area. And up until then, I mean, search was fairly stable. I mean, the algorithm didn't change that often. The old school techniques of SEO worked. You put up some content, you got some internal links, and you got some external links. It was, it was pretty easy in those days to make things rank. And then, that world changed. We started getting the penalty era. right? When Google rolled out Panda and Penguin, which, they're black and white animals. It's a logistic function. You're good or bad. There's no in between. Um, and that kept moving. And while that did, there were some quiet things going on in the background. Like Google bought a company called Freebase, which is, part of how they built their knowledge graph. And Sergey Brin and the other co-founder of Google, they had always had it in their mind that one of the ways that you can fix search is through entities, right? Like language has all this ambiguity built into it, and one of the ways you clean that up is with brands, he said. But in the patents and the papers they were writing back in those days, they were talking about entities and knowledge graphs. And that was as early as, I think, 98, I'm going to say. So that seed was already planted way back when.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, it was planted really far back in the past. And so they finally got their hands on Freebase, and they were setting up a long game to get us to entities, right? There's a difference in the English language between a White House and the White House, right? And typically in these older models, you would strip out the A and the, and you would just have White House. What do you do with that, right? Yeah. Because it's also a special entity of a place, and so they needed to start defining that, people, places, things, right? It's like remember those labeling machines we had back in the 80s? It's like that. You're just like walking around labeling things. And one of the things that does, it allows them to get around that ambiguity of search. It allows them to provide a better experience for their customers. If I'm just using a keyword, Jaguar, well, Jaguar can be, a car, it can be an animal. It can also be a guitar, right? Yeah. Like, which one? And then if you go and look in the knowledge graph, they have different codes for those things. And based on your search history and all of these other features that Google has, they can kind of shape what that search experience is supposed to be like. And so that starts getting us out of this area of just simple keywords, right? And then we started getting more complicated match types, even for paid. And so when that happened was right around the hummingbird algorithm. Notice we're not dealing with black and white animals anymore. We've got this colorful, fast, beating, frenzy thing, just looking for wherever the sweet nectar is on the web. And we all knew in SEO that like something strange had happened. Like we saw, like there was this like subconscious shift that we all felt. And we weren't able to quite put our fingers on it. I mean, Grant and I had multiple arguments about this way back in those days. But he's now on kind of, the same side as me with semantic search. But you used to create a page for car insurance and you would make a page for auto insurance. And then we saw all of a sudden you couldn't have both ranking anymore. So this idea of entities allows those synonyms to collapse together. So Google understands that they're actually the same thing. And that then causes you to shift strategies. No, we don't need an exact match term per page, right? That's that old, I think Bruce Clay kind of ran by that model. Yep. It was part of his trainings. It's not to say that it doesn't work anymore, but in those cases of synonyms, that may not be a strategy you want to follow because one will win.
Yeah, well, it's really hard for the user too. Like we used to back in the day, because for the listeners here that don't know us as well, we built healthcare success back started in 2006 with SEO. That's how we did it. It was with knowledge, thought leadership, speaking, and SEO especially. And so I'm totally an SEO geek at heart for sure. Not as much as you are and some of our teammates, but certainly more than most CEOs. But I remember thinking about that back in the day of like how stupid it is to try to do all these sort of very artificial things to appease the search engines, because the user experience is worse. Like the user was like, wait, is it auto insurance or car insurance? Like, why is that? And so it became a very contrived, very bulky kind of mess. I'd like it to continue, but I think it's like and then maybe you could weave this into your comments as you continue here, Brandon, but having been to the Google campuses many times, they really do talk a lot about, user experience and relevancy and user intent. Even back then, like they want to satisfy the user. The whole point of this is satisfy the user. Even though, companies like us and our clients are paying them money, really they look at the free user, the actual end user as their customer. So continue, but I think it's really interesting how it started getting more like people than just these very sort of on the nose kind of searches.
Right. And because from a head term, right, like we were just talking about, like, I don't know, auto insurance, we could say health insurance. We have to be thinking, pretty directly that what's behind that is someone has a need, right? And what is that need? So, and if the way that that's being asked is changing, we have to be more adaptive to that. In the same way as, like, you had a website and then you had a mobile site, right? Like, why not just be smart and have one code base, right? And so I think in this case, Google thinks in that same way. Like, why not have an experience that can shift and honor all of those intents? And so you see that in their approach to text-based search and their extension into, at that same time that Hummingbird came out, we were finally able to ask direct questions. That was, and we were all like, oh my God, voice search is the next big thing. And what are we going to do about it? How do we track it? And, but it's true. And then it's like, all right, we can then break down terms into like the who, what, where, when, why, how, all of that. And maybe do it that way. And it started making tracking more difficult, which means even on the paid side, it starts making things like attribution more difficult in these worlds. So long story short, then, with the collapse of synonyms and all of this bulky content that we were generating, on top of that, remember, you also had like paid landing pages and special ones for display and email marketing, and then you've multiplied your site.
I remember mobile websites for about 10 minutes there.
Right? Like, and so here we are. We spent like 10 years of our lives like building this gigantic trash bucket of content for all these different experiences, when in reality you just really needed one. And is it the right one? So one thing we noticed at that time too was we started seeing these shifts of people just kind of not searching as much on the head term front. Like historically they have volume, but then you were seeing, because of those questions, we were starting to see people ask things like, which running shoes are vegan friendly? And then what do you do? What do you do with that? Right? Like, how do you classify that as a product? Does it have to be do you have to have a category for shoes and then like specifically non-leather shoes? Do you even use the label vegan? Or like, and then when you work with these other, massive sites at scale, you imagine the argument that would cause in a product room? Like, and those things do happen actually. And so by that, then, like, you're not really optimizing towards a term there. You're optimizing towards an experience of a particular audience. This audience is interested in vegan friendly things. So what are they looking for on the site? That means you have to have something that curates, a whole catalog to that event. If you're like a massive site, for instance. You could think about, the IKEAs of the world, for instance, as well, in that same sense. If, you probably noted that just like curved furniture has been a thing in all the magazines lately. Like, how do you optimize for someone searching for that? Right. And so those are, those are questions, that the people in the big e-com side have to answer. But on the healthcare space, it gets even more complicated. You can track someone searching for a couch, right? You can like haunt them in like every app that they have, including TV and billboards and all sorts of stuff. But it's much harder in healthcare to know which experiences are best, and which are going to drive them into their final moment of truth. So I think part of that shift then is it was already kind of moving away from head terms and more towards this like middle of funnel gray area. Your bottom of funnel, it's kind of like at that point you're either remembering a brand or you're remembering a product name or you're remembering the address of the house you're looking at. Like you kind of like hone in and you get obsessed. Now if it's heading there already, almost a decade ago, and I think Rand Fishkin brought this up in his Spark Toro stuff. We were chatting about it earlier. Like it means that we have almost less ability to measure anything else, but like what ends up at that experience in some way, shape, or form. And so one of the things that he said, what was it, back in 2012, 2013, somewhere around there, 2014, he was looking at, how much of traffic in Google doesn't even get to organic, doesn't get the organic click through or doesn't get the paid click through. It just gets trapped in Google's world. And they get trapped there because Google had a better experience than you did on your site, dummy. Like they're better at it than you. And they keep getting better at it. And so those are challenges for us in marketing. They're challenges for our clients. We had the horror story just recently when Google released AI overviews. You probably remember where they were telling us to eat rocks and telling us to put glue on our pizza, and a bunch of us SEOs are like, what is this flaming mess doing on the web already, guys? And they pulled it back, and then it got better. And that's just such a different experience, right? It's like a SERP within a SERP. And yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say it's like a SERP within a SERP. Like it's a completely different way of thinking about optimization and how you're going to do traffic acquisition.
So let's talk about so another topic that's really hot today is AIs, learning language models, different things that are going on currently. Give us a sense about what's going on, particularly with AI and other sort of related topics.
Well, I mean, like AI related topics. I mean, if you think about it, this was like the grand scheme of things for Google, right? This was always their final. This is the part of the story arc they've been pushing towards for a long, long time. And we kind of talk in the SEO world about the algorithm, right? But it's not just a single thing, right? It's like thousands of microservices doing, all the scoring and rating and feedback loops from user signals. It's essentially, most people playing with things like ChatGPT or whatnot. It's essentially search in reverse, right? It's just instead of sucking things in, it's pushing things out.
And so, like the large language models, schema, AI, like I know a lot of our listeners aren't up on some of these things in terms of how that impacts search, but I guess I'm just trying to figure out, like we talked a lot about the history of search a little while ago, but now, and we also talked a little bit about, zero-click search, right? So we've got, that's increasingly happening. But as we start looking at where the puck is going, I mean, AI is, everybody talks about to death, right? But I think, can we give us some more context around any of these kinds of topics that, and like, why does it matter? How do we prepare? Like, for example, schema, is that increasingly important? Like, help us understand like these kinds of things in a very layman's way that doesn't lose everybody here.
Oh, yeah.
And technical too. We have technical people too, but we have executives, marketers, and tech people. So I know it's trying to appease all those audiences at once, Brandon.
All right, here come my 8 heads. I think the way we can break it down is I'll retrace my steps a little bit. So we were at that place where we're like labeling things, right? And not a lot of people got it at first. And in the healthcare space, there's like tons of ways to do this, right? Where you have to come in, you have people may have like signs or symptoms of a disease, right? And then what happens there? Then you also need to list out the conditions that those signs and symptoms align to. And then you have to have from there, like, what are the potential treatments of that thing? Is it a prescription? Is it a shot? Is it a diet change? And so all of those connections outside of not just like labeling them for machines to understand, it's also kind of like what your brain does in general. So they're starting to do this more human mapping of the world. Now, in the early days, you had to do this like strict labeling, and then as these processes that eventually is what has become large language models, um, started to extract those things from the unstructured stuff on your page, right? You and I, we get to a web page, we automatically see a price, we see a product name, we see ratings and reviews, we see stars, we see where can I do in-store pickup, right? A bot doesn't. It's just strings of text. And so it doesn't know like what those strings of text apply to. So those pieces where you go in and label it as a product and a product title and rating and review and offer price versus the regular price, they're getting pretty good at those things. They're and they've gotten better at being able to like look at a page of content and know that this page of content is about a song called Brat, and Brat is written by so and so, and and it knows like the birthplace of the person, and it can pull all of those details together into that kind of knowledge graph. Those knowledge graphs are what's behind what GPT or Gemini or all these things spit out the other side. They know the facts and the interrelationships of the facts. So if you're a brand, the things like signs and symptoms, conditions, potential treatments, service areas, insurance providers, which insurance providers apply to which specific service that you offer, or how many services are actually offered at a location. That provides like really important data for search engines if someone's trying to figure out if they need to go to like an emergency room versus an urgent care, right? And so for us, it's not like someone shopping for a vegan shoe. This could be like a life or death moment, what Google calls like your money or your life moment. You don't have the right information for that algorithm to pick up at the right exact time. Oops. But that's a big oops, right? That's not somebody lost their wallet over the weekend. It's someone may not have gotten the critical care that they needed. So the stakes are even higher, I think, for us in healthcare marketing, for sure.
Yeah, it's funny too, and like to go step away from healthcare marketing, the way the knowledge is now organized. I remember a couple of years ago talking to somebody, or maybe it was an article, it was talking about how Google would soon be able to easily give you answers to questions that are more obscure, like 2 or 3 steps. So, for example, I remember this, and I looked it up recently. When was Jimi Hendrix's father born? So you have to figure out, okay, first of all, who's Jimi Hendrix? Is there anything on that? And then find out. And so I asked my Google Home Assistant recently and it came back and said that Jimi Hendrix's father was a musician. He was born on this date in this town. He gave me more than I asked for. And so that sort of knowledge graph, I guess, is the terminology that you'd use for that, of like how all these things fit together, but it's infinite essentially. Like, how do they do that? And in healthcare, it's far more complicated than that. So as it begins to pick up, and it's interesting, like there's some legal issues here, but I can imagine someday people will say, "Hey, Google, am I having a stroke?" Right? And it's like, because what are the symptoms? Raise your hand, try to smile. Like, that's a little scary because it's like they don't want to take on that legal liability, but on the other hand, that might save someone's life. It's like where they'd say call 911. So it's extraordinarily complex, and we don't have it today, but those of you that are sort of follow us, maybe on subsequent webinars, we'll share with you some of the tools that Brandon brings to share these sort of knowledge graphs and how they all interrelate, and then how do we do that. And I guess, practically speaking, because I didn't ask you to do that prior to this meeting, like as you're looking at a new site and you're looking at, like what we're trying to rank for and all this very complex as it relates together, are there any tips on how, or maybe where the low hanging fruit is, or is it just different every time? Like, because I thought typically the sites we see can be pretty big and pretty complex, but they don't usually have evidence of thinking like this. Like, how does this information fit together? And then versus information elsewhere on the web, and how do you rank? Any comments on that?
Yeah. So how this would eventually tie together, right? We were talking about like signs, symptoms, conditions, treatments, right? Labeling all the things. Um, from there, that can almost drive a lot of your content strategy. And in this case, if we're dealing with smaller sites, it's a little easier, right? Because you can kind of get into the weeds on a set of terms and the associated terms and the associated terms to the associated terms. You can mine all of the questions that people are asking, which is a good place to start, right? You're taking kind of the central theme, the business purpose of a company, and mapping it out in that knowledge graph way. So I know that already coming off the bat, if someone's having trouble eating and they're having trouble sleeping and they're just suffering general anxiety, then I know I have certain pieces of content that I'm going to need from that sort of older text-based world of search. But outside of that, there's also like, what experiences are you giving them on your site? The one thing we see continually as we look through a lot of the healthcare space, particularly with mental health, I've been seeing it quite a bit, is like how many tools are there actually out there that help people to self-diagnose? In the example you were just giving, like, am I having a stroke? They're like, no, but you might have PTSD. I sometimes think I have anxiety. It just turns out I forget to eat sometimes, but those decision boundaries are important. And having, I think, tools and assessments and things that actually help people on, that is going to increase the reach of your brand. And if Google says, well, brand's the way you clean up the cesspool of the web, your brand is an entity. It's like a living thing to the search engines. And I think that's a kind of an important point, that at the end of the day, as we're doing all this work for SEO, it really is about building up a brand, right? And so I'm gonna pause there for a second because I'm sure you've got this look in your eyes. I can see it from here. Oh, I lost your sound.
There we go. So I want to bring that back to though. You're right. So the mind mode, the Brandon Stewart mind mode, is strong in this one. So mixing movies there. So we talked about healthcare and like kind of where you're going with the brand, and I think this is important because we talk a lot about brand strategy and what's the messaging and how do you be relevant to the consumer. Meanwhile, like on the search side, you have a bunch of different things going on, especially emotional state and urgency. And like, how does something like, I must say, like, what does emotional state have to do with SEO and like the urgency? I'd love you to expand a little bit more on that.
Well, if you're looking at third-party tools and you're looking to see, where the majority of your traffic is coming from, one of the things I used to say way back in my agency days was there's this we have all these devices and we have all of these different avenues and paths to get to certain kinds of information, and you're going to have a different sense of urgency when you're sitting at home on your laptop while you're watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and like, you're just kind of like doing research, but if you're, if you're out and about and all of a sudden you have this thing happen to you and like you need to find help, you don't park your car and open up your laptop. You put the voice search on in your phone and you start, looking for the closest whatever you need. Those are two different kinds of time and timing is how I used to phrase it after Douglas Rushkoff, his famous quote. His quote is, time is knowing, time is dad, I wrecked the car. Timing is knowing to tell dad you wrecked the car after he's had a scotch in his paper. and and so in this, there's a pattern that we're seeing in the data from organic search traffic, at least what we can see, is that a good majority of the time in the health space, the majority of the traffic comes in through desktop. But a good majority of conversions for people in this space come from mobile. So that tells us that there's this kind of thinking and bubbling like that more upper funnel moment. It takes a much longer cycle to brew. But then in their moment of truth, they know exactly where they're going to, on their mobile device, and they convert there. And so what that means, kind of jokingly flashing back to our different site for desktop and mobile years, it means your mobile experience has to be up to snuff, right? It has to be as frictionless as possible. And making that as frictionless as possible isn't necessarily an SEO problem. That's an experience problem, right? But we still have to fix that as part of what we do.
Well, actually, I have a question on that, because with the leak on the Google documents recently, and we should cover that on another day. The idea of dwell time, or how long somebody's spending on the page, is something new. That's something that people weren't giving any credit before. But that the CRO would make, or the conversion rate optimization of the consumer experience, has a much bigger impact on that, right? And does that, so as you're looking at new websites and we bring in and do our audits, is that one of the important things that you're thinking about a lot? Is because that does matter. It's a little less obvious, but it definitely matters today.
Yeah, it definitely matters. And it's come out in the court cases and the API documents, just how much of Google's algorithm is them quote unquote faking it, in their own words, where they're using a lot of these user signals as proxies. And it's really, really interesting. It's not just dwell time. It's also where did they scroll in the page, and how far, and how long did they stay there? Did they go to a different tab and then come back? There's all of this stuff, floating around for years. Rand Fishkin did studies on this, even on the click-through rate for years. And it plays a much bigger role. And I think that also dovetails with design, and the necessity of having design kind of be coupled with SEO projects, is to create that frictionless experience, to create something that keeps them there on the page, or provides them that little extra nudge, that little bit of extra comfort, I guess, if you will, to fill out the form to get your loved one into, let's say a rehab center, or get them into a proper mental health system, or check that you have the right insurance before you go, to whatever center it is you need to go to. All of those things, funny enough, still end up in the SEO bucket because we have to do it.
Yeah, so it's funny. I mean, we're hopefully past this, but not really. We're still not. I remember back speaking for maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago. This was really common. It's still a problem. Actually, still to this day. But at least 50% of the people we talked to back then would come to us and say, "Okay, great. We just did our website. Now it's time for you guys to help us with the SEO." And my answer is, no. I know, it's laugh out loud funny. So, and also, we're here ready to talk about the marketing again. It's no, please, no. And my metaphor for that was, and still is, it's like buying a car, then ripping the top off and making it a convertible. It would have been a lot better to design it as a convertible in the first place, so it was all functioning together. And so, I mean, it was complex before, but now it's really complex, because you're thinking about, all right, we need to make it work from a conversion rate optimization perspective, meaning getting people to call. We need to make it work for audiences, and that could include, for example, patients, families, donors, referring doctors, employees, and always Google. So how do we make that work? And then how do we work through the design aspect versus the content and messaging aspect and the SEO aspect? And oh my God, Brandon, it's so hard what we do, but you have to, right? I mean, there's all those things, and you have to get best practices, and also some, I think, experience on what really matters, because it's going to be really hard to break this down algorithmically that every single one of these factors is 0.3% of the whole thing. But it definitely is works or it doesn't. And I would just, I would recommend to listeners, as we're sort of talking tech talk today, to remember that the key thing is working with a team on this stuff to do it right, right? To be thinking about what are the paid, you mentioned earlier, what do the paid search people need? What do the SEO team need? How can you do this all on the same site? And sometimes we have to make special landing pages. Sometimes it's just daunting. Like the site is so bad, we just have to do a series of landing pages. But ideally, it all works well together. Another thing too, and I have one more question, but I'll make a couple of quick statements. What Google even wants and says it wants isn't always necessarily rewarded by the algorithm. So we get into things like, for example, multiple brands under one holding company. Do we have a bunch of microsites, or do we have a single major site? And that's not as easy to answer as you would think. And so it also depends on the history. So there's a lot where Google may have this official position, they like this, but the real world, it turns out that they're rewarding something completely different, and it changes. So it gets complex. So all of these things really come down to user intent. And I mentioned that earlier at the very beginning. Google really cares a lot about user intent and what people are trying to actually achieve so it fulfills what they're looking for. But you said something very disturbing to me recently, like, SEO tools don't typically give you any sense of intent. What? So expand more on what that means, because that's be alarming.
Well, they give you a little bit, but it's still not great, because those algorithms that they use for that, aren't really that advanced. They're getting better, but essentially all we can do is we can see, oh, this is more informational intent, but it's not the term that's informational intent. It's the SERP, like the actual search engine results page.
Good point. Yeah.
Go and look at it, and you just see like, okay, in the top we get these 3 informational sites. Okay, then we might get a local pack. We might get, a couple more informational sites before you get to some site that has something you can purchase. And that's changed a lot. And that is constantly shifting. I've seen on a number of occasions, especially heading into COVID and coming out of COVID, it was just crazy. A lot of the much larger sites, didn't perform well. And there were things where we saw like Google floating up more local businesses that were trying to kind of stay alive. They were trying to do something good at that point. There are a lot of changes there. And Google's doing it all the time, right? At any given time, they have, over 200 tests running wild out there.
Yeah.
And so
we have this, I got to interrupt you on that. This little, nobody's had a problem with the helpful content updates. So
well, yeah, another example.
Yeah, so that's a big one. And that's probably relevant to a fair number of our listeners. Like, what's the latest on that? And so I'll back up a little if people don't know this world. So the helpful content update or updates was started. I mean, there's been multiple of them, but the most recent one's about a year old now, Brandon. The one that just sort of throttled a lot of websites. So it feels like you live this every minute of every day. I just meet with you once a week or two, but it feels like it may be the overreach of that algorithm is being corrected by Google, because they just pretty much penalized anybody that wasn't a big brand. But I'd love to hear your kind of comments on that evolution, because it's probably relevant to a lot of our listeners. A lot of them were probably smacked down over the last year or so, and give them some hope or stern warnings or whatever is applicable from your standpoint.
Yeah, well, I mean, Google's guidance on that hasn't exactly been the best. I mean, because you could write content that people actually read, and use, but somehow it doesn't pass the muster of the Google helpful content classifier, right? Like, what does that mean? And SEOs, we've been asking that for 2 years, like, oh yeah, it's really helpful.
Yeah.
And there's some tongue in cheek that comes out of us because we have our tinfoil hats on all day long. That over this time, what you saw was like a rise in, like Reddit, for instance, with all over the place, right? They were just rising and rising and rising in terms of their traffic and fees. And a lot of that's user generated content, which is where we got, so I think that's how the source of like put glue on your pizza came from, possibly.
Yeah.
But, and I think it's that it was providing the content was providing search engines with maybe fodder that it didn't have already in that giant web of facts, right? And because maybe it was so unique, that was what was seen as helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess, like, it's funny because, and we've got to wrap up here in a minute, but if we just look at, for example, the trend for longer blogs, okay, longer blogs, longer blogs, okay, really, really long blogs. And then, but we know users don't read 3,000 words very, very rarely. You have to be invested to read that. And so that, sort of rubber band is snapping back, right? So it's a complicated target that isn't clearly defined anyway. And then oftentimes it's not really the right target you should be shooting for. So, because those like I said, writing a 3,000 word blog is expensive, and if nobody's reading it, what exactly are we proving? And then when Google looks at the data, here it feels like, go do this. Oh, smack you did that. So write this 3,000 word blog. Oh, wait, nobody's making it past the second paragraph. Okay, now we're going to penalize that page. I mean, there's not like a person doing this, but that's effectively what's happening, right? So I feel like a puppy, like being like, wait, run, don't run. I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
So then to wrap up, then I guess this is, obviously we touched on, I don't know, a dozen or two topics out of hundreds you and I talk about and geek out about a lot. I guess I would just, as we wrap up, in case somebody's, really wondering, their own website, how do I, if they're frustrated with the helpful content update or they're not getting anywhere. I mean, that's why we do audits. But so of course you guys can call us if you're interested in that. But short of that, Brandon, any other last comments or advice?
I would say a lot of time, like with the helpful content update in particular, like a lot of people got hurt, right? And had good content. So I think this is when we maybe take a step back and maybe ask, well, Google's just going to suck this stuff up and throw it in an AI overview. And anyway, and it's not going to bring us traffic. Then what's the point? Should we even worry about content anymore? If they're just, people could just be generating it on the fly, and then you have AI eating AI all day. Take a step back and think about what's the experience that you need to produce, right? What's the experience of a mother that's grieving and trying to get her son into rehab, right? What experience does she need to get the help that she needs? Because at the end of the day, if you're making a good experience, and this kind of comes back to that network you just talked about from the Google leaks, right? Google's still seeing all those user signals, right, which is really what you want in the end. So I think if you're providing that good experience, you'll do well, regardless of the channel. SEO just happens to be the one that has to take care of most of it.
Well, we've got plenty to do for a long time, Brandon. I don't think we're ever going to work ourselves out of a job on this stuff. Thank you for your insights today. It's always fun. This may have been a little shop talky for some of our clients, but this is the stuff that we do, and it's the stuff that matters. It does have an impact. Hopefully we try to translate most of this without